You always find a reason to be here, don't you? It started with something small, a cup of coffee, still warm, carried through the drizzle on a gray Thursday morning. I told myself it was just a kind gesture, that I was only stopping by to check how her new project was going. But even as I pushed open the creaky door of her art studio, I knew I was lying to myself. Clara's studio always smelled faintly of linseed oil and rain. Light spilled through the tall windows, pale and diffused, catching the fine dust of paint in the air. She stood by the easel, a loose cardigan draped over her shoulders, strands of hair pinned up carelessly. When she turned at the sound of the door, her smile was small but steady, the kind that warms you before you realize it's happening. You again? She teased softly, arching one brow as she wiped her hands on a paint rag. You always find a reason to be here, don't you? Her tone wasn't sharp. It was gentle, amused, touched with something that made my pulse slow. I laughed, a little too quickly. You make it sound like a bad habit. Is it? She asked, her eyes lingering on me longer than politeness required. Then she turned back to the canvas, brush gliding through shades of blue. The conversation drifted, about art, weather, and how people forget to notice silence. But underneath every word was an awareness neither of us acknowledged out loud. I watched the way her hand moved, precise, sure, deliberate. Every motion felt like a kind of quiet grace. When she stepped aside to rinse her brush, her sleeve brushed my hand. It was nothing, a light, accidental touch, yet it sent a spark through the air, subtle but undeniable. You look tired, she said suddenly, glancing up at me. Long week? I nodded. You could say that. She smiled, not out of pity, but understanding. Then stop working so hard to explain yourself. Just be here. Her words hung in the air longer than they should have. Maybe she didn't mean them the way I heard them, but they landed in that quiet space between us, stirring something restless. I stayed longer than I planned to, helping her move a few canvases, talking about nothing that really mattered. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, and the smell of coffee and paint wrapped around us like something familiar. When I finally left, the door closed behind me with a soft click. The evening light stretched long shadows across the wet pavement. I walked to my car slowly, her voice replaying in my head, that teasing line that had felt like a question and a warning all at once. You always find a reason to be here, don't you? She was right. I did. And as I sat in my car with the engine off, watching the raindrops chase each other across the windshield, I realized I wasn't coming for the art anymore. I was coming for her. The next time I saw her, I had a screwdriver in one hand and an excuse in the other. Clara had mentioned, almost in passing, that one of her studio windows didn't close properly. It was nothing urgent, but it was enough of a reason to return, to hear her voice again, to step into that space that somehow felt steadier than the rest of my week. When I knocked, she opened the door halfway, surprised but not displeased. You again, she said with that same teasing lilt, though her eyes softened as they met mine. Let me guess, you just happened to be in the neighborhood with a toolbox? Something like that, I said, holding it up like proof. You said the latch sticks? She shook her head, smiling as she stepped aside to let me in. You really can't help yourself, can you? The studio looked different this time, afternoon light spilling across the floor, brushes soaking in jars, a record playing faintly in the corner. She perched on a stool while I worked by the window. I could feel her gaze now and then, like a quiet pulse at the edge of my attention. So, she said after a while, is this your hobby? Fixing things that don't need fixing? I glanced back, grinning. I like making things work. She murmured, tilting her head. Maybe you just like being needed. Her words slipped under my skin before I could laugh them off. She wasn't wrong. There was a truth in them I didn't want to face. As I fiddled with the latch, I noticed her sketchbook open on her lap. Lines curved and crossed, forming shapes I didn't recognize. I leaned closer. Is that you? She interrupted, her lips curving. I blinked. Me? Don't look so surprised, she said, smiling now. You were focused. People don't realize how honest their faces are when they're trying too hard. I didn't know what to say. The sound of rain starting up outside filled the pause between us. She rose from the stool and came closer to inspect my work, her shoulder brushing mine as she leaned toward the window. The contact was brief, skin against fabric, warmth through distance, but it left me completely still. There, I said finally, clearing my throat. Fixed. She smiled, eyes still on the latch. It was never really broken. We both laughed softly, though neither of us moved away. For a moment, the sound of her laugh mixed with the rain tapping against the glass, and the air felt thick with something fragile and new. When I left that evening, she followed me to the door. Thank you, she said quietly. For this. I nodded, but as I walked to my car, I knew what she meant wasn't about the window. It was about the silence we'd shared, the small kindness between us that was beginning to feel like something deeper, something we were both pretending not to name. You said, it was her message that broke the rhythm of my week, short, almost hesitant. Would you have time to help me with something at the gallery? I must have read it 3 times before replying. She'd never texted me first before. I told myself it was nothing, that she just needed an extra pair of hands, but my heart didn't quite believe that story. The gallery was quiet when I arrived, all white walls and echoing footsteps. Clara was standing on a ladder, arranging one of her canvases, a few strands of hair falling loose against her neck. She looked softer there, smaller against the wide space. When she saw me, her face lit with surprise, then something like relief. You came, she said. Of course I did, I replied, pretending it was obvious, though in truth, I would have dropped anything to be there. For the next hour, we worked side by side, hanging her paintings, adjusting lights, debating angles. There was an ease between us I hadn't expected, laughter that came naturally, silences that didn't feel heavy. But underneath it, something deeper pulsed, an awareness that neither of us dared name. At one point, one of the larger frames slipped as she tried to steady it. I stepped forward, hands catching the edge just before it tilted. Her fingers met mine on the wooden frame, light contact, brief but electric. She froze, breath catching, eyes lifting to meet mine. The world seemed to pause there, no sound, no movement, just that stillness between us. She smiled first, a little flustered, a little brave. Good reflexes, she murmured. Instinct, I said quietly. Couldn't let it fall. Her gaze lingered a moment too long, then dropped back to the canvas. We didn't talk about it again, but we both knew something had shifted, like a curtain slightly drawn aside. When the setup was done, we sat on the gallery floor surrounded by empty boxes and half-drunk coffee cups. The city noise outside felt distant. She leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. I almost didn't text you, she said suddenly. Why not? I didn't want to bother you. I wasn't sure if I should. I turned to look at her. You can always call me Clara. You could ask me for anything. Her eyes opened, soft but searching. You really mean that? I nodded, and she smiled, small, genuine, touched with something tender. We stayed there for a while longer, not needing to fill the silence. There was comfort in it, the quiet rhythm of shared breath, the faint hum of the lights above us. As we left, she stopped at the door. Thank you, she said, her voice low, almost shy. I smiled back. You don't have to thank me for showing up. And as I walked into the night air, her words, and the warmth in them, followed me home, like a light I couldn't quite put out. It was raining again the evening I showed up at her studio. I hadn't planned to go. I told myself I'd just drive past, maybe see if the lights were on. But when I saw that faint golden glow behind the rain-streaked windows, something in me turned the wheel before my head could argue. She opened the door wearing a soft gray sweater, sleeves pushed up, her hair pulled back loosely. Paint dotted the edge of her wrists like freckles. Her smile appeared before her words did. You always find a reason to be here, don't you? I exhaled a laugh, water dripping from my hair. Maybe I just like the sound of the rain on your windows. She shook her head but didn't move aside immediately. Her gaze lingered, warm, a little weary, but welcoming. Then she stepped back, and I crossed the threshold, shaking off the chill. The studio was bathed in that golden lamplight again, and the smell of paint and rain mixed into something almost nostalgic. She was working on a canvas, a large one, muted tones of blue and amber blending into something that looked like dusk. I stood a few feet away, quietly watching the way her hand moved, slow and precise, the brush sweeping in rhythmic arcs. "You paint like you're listening to something," I said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe I am. What do you hear?" "Everything I don't say out loud." The honesty in her voice stopped me. I could feel the unspoken weight in it, the kind of truth people only share when they forget they're being watched. She must have felt my silence stretch, because she turned, offering me the brush. "Here," she said. "Try it." I blinked. "I'll ruin it." She laughed softly, not mocking, but kind. "Then ruin it beautifully." So I stepped closer. The handle was still warm from her touch. She stood beside me, guiding my hand toward the canvas. "Don't think," she whispered. "Just feel the color." Her hand rested lightly over mine, steadying the motion. Our shoulders brushed, and I could hear her breathing, calm, even, close enough to blur the boundary between us. The world narrowed to the smell of paint, the rhythm of her voice, the slow movement of our joined hands across the surface. When she finally stepped back, the space between us felt different, fragile, charged. She studied the mark I'd made, a clumsy streak that somehow worked. "See?" she murmured. "Not ruined at all." Her smile was small, but her eyes lingered on me longer than before. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, heart unsteady. Outside, the rain had softened to a whisper. I wiped my palms on my jeans, leaving faint smudges of blue. "I should go," I said, though neither of us moved. She only nodded. "All right." Her voice was quiet, but something in it asked me to stay. As I left, the brushstroke we made together gleamed faintly in the lamplight, a piece of her world marked by both of us, still drying, still alive. For days after that night, I tried not to think about her. I told myself I was just giving her space, that I didn't want to seem too eager, too transparent. But every time I walked past her street, my eyes found that familiar studio window. The light was always there, steady, golden. Like it was waiting. On Friday, I gave in. I told myself it was just a visit, that I had something to give her, a reason to show up again. It wasn't a gift, not exactly. Just a photograph I'd taken at her gallery opening, Clara mid-laugh, sunlight spilling through the window behind her, her hand covering her mouth in that quiet, graceful way she had. When she opened the door, surprise flickered across her face, followed by a softness that made me forget every excuse I'd rehearsed. "I brought you something," I said, holding out the small frame. She took it carefully, as if it were fragile. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, in a voice quieter than usual, she said, "You see people too well. That's dangerous." I frowned, unsure. "Dangerous?" She nodded slowly, her thumb tracing the edge of the frame. "Because when someone sees you that clearly, it's hard to stay hidden." Something in her tone, half vulnerability, half warning, made my chest tighten. We sat down, the space between us filled with the hum of the rain outside. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," I said softly. Her eyes lifted to mine. "You didn't. You just remind me what it feels like to be seen. It's been a long time." She leaned back, exhaling. The faintest smile tugged at her lips. "People assume confidence means certainty. It doesn't. I've just learned to keep my hands busy when my heart doesn't know what to do." For a long time, we didn't speak. I just listened, to the creak of the chair beneath her, to the soft rhythm of her breathing, to the sound of a truth she hadn't planned to share. Then she asked quietly, "Why do you keep coming here?" I hesitated. Every honest answer felt too heavy too soon. "Because I like being around you," I said finally. "Because it feels calm here." Her gaze lingered on me, searching. Maybe she saw what I couldn't say. When I stood to leave, she followed me to the door, as she always did. But this time, when I reached for the handle, she caught my hand, lightly, almost uncertainly. Her fingers were cool from the studio air. For a heartbeat, either of us moved. Her thumb brushed once across my knuckles, a small, absent motion that said more than words could. "Good night," she whispered, her voice steady but softer than before. I left into the misty night, her touch still on my hand, her words still echoing, "You see people too well." What she didn't know, or maybe she did, was that she'd become the only person I wanted to see that clearly. You said the weeks that followed felt heavier, like the quiet between two notes in a song. People had started to notice, subtle glances, half smiles, the kind of teasing that carries more truth than humor. A friend at work asked if I'd been helping the artist again. Another joke that I must be in love with her paintings. I laughed it off, but it stayed with me, whispering questions I didn't want to answer out loud. By the time I returned to Clara's studio, the familiar comfort had been replaced by hesitation. I stood outside for a full minute before knocking, rehearsing a casual smile I didn't quite feel. When she opened the door, her expression softened but her eyes searched mine. "You look like someone who's been thinking too much," she said, stepping aside. "Maybe I have," I admitted. The air inside was warm with the smell of turpentine and faint citrus from the tea she'd been drinking. She changed the place since I'd last been there. New canvases leaned against the walls, all half-finished, streaked with moody colors. "You've been busy," I said, trying to sound light. She nodded. "It helps to paint when I don't know what to feel." Her words landed deeper than she meant. We both knew what she was avoiding naming. I sat on the edge of the workbench while she rinsed her brushes, her movements careful, deliberate. "People have started talking," I said finally. Her hands paused mid-motion. "About us. About me being here. About how often." She turned slowly, drying her hands on a cloth. There wasn't surprise in her face, just understanding, and something that looked like fear hidden beneath composure. "They will talk," she said softly. "They always do." The silence that followed was long enough to hear the rain beginning again outside. "Does it bother you?" she asked. I looked up at her. "It does. But not enough to stay away." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Then she crossed the room and stood a few feet in front of me. Her expression was unreadable, caught between reason and something more fragile. "You're young," she began, voice steady but low. "You still have places to go, people to meet. This, whatever this is," she exhaled, shaking her head, "it could complicate things for you." "Maybe," I said. "But I'm already here, Clara. Complicated or not." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she took a slow step closer. Her hand lifted slightly, almost reaching out, before falling back to her side. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because I might start believing you." Her eyes shimmered then, caught between caution and want. I didn't move closer, either did she. The tension wasn't in the space between us anymore. It was in the restraint, and the ache of what we weren't ready to name. That night, when I finally left, the rain had stopped. But as I walked away, I knew something had shifted. We both said enough without saying anything at all, and there was no going back to pretending at the end of her exhibit came quietly, without ceremony. The crowd had thinned, the lights dimmed, and her paintings, those fragments of color and emotion, were being taken down one by one. I showed up to help, as I always did. This time, she didn't tease me about finding a reason. She just smiled when I arrived, a little tired but warm, like she'd been expecting me all along. We worked in silence for a while, the kind that feels easy between people who no longer need to fill it. I lifted frames, folded cloths, packed away brushes. She labeled boxes with her careful handwriting. Every now and then, our hands brushed, and neither of us pulled away. The air was still, thick with the sense that something was ending, or maybe, quietly beginning. "You'll miss this place," I said, breaking the quiet. Clara looked around the studio. The light-stained floors, the streaks of paint on the walls, the faint echo of laughter that seemed to live there. Maybe, she said softly. But I think I'll miss what it felt like more than the place itself. What did it feel like? I asked. She smiled, a little wistful. Alive. Something about the word made my chest tighten. I wanted to tell her that she made me feel the same, that her steadiness had become the center of my days. But I didn't. Instead, I kept wrapping a canvas in brown paper, pretending I wasn't memorizing every quiet second. When we finished, I carried the last crate to her car. The sky had started to darken, that soft, golden light giving way to a dusky blue. She stood by the open trunk, watching me. There was something unreadable in her expression, gratitude, sadness, something gentler hiding beneath both. You don't have to keep finding reasons to come by, she said finally. Her tone was calm, but her voice caught faintly at the edges. You can just come. For a second, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't dramatic, no music, no grand gesture, just a simple sentence that carried everything we hadn't said. Are you sure? I asked quietly. She stepped closer, close enough for me to see the fine lines near her eyes, the soft color of paint still clinging to her wrist. I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't. The space between us dissolved then, not with a kiss or anything reckless, but with something far more intimate. She reached up and brushed a fleck of dust from my shirt, her hand lingering just a heartbeat longer than it needed to. I felt her breath near my collarbone, steady and warm. We stood there like that for a long moment, two people who had spent months circling around unspoken truths, now finally standing still. When she finally pulled back, her voice was soft. Stay for tea? I nodded. Always. As we walked back toward the studio, the last traces of sunlight spilled across the floorboards. The world outside kept moving, cars, rain, life, but inside that small, paint-streaked room, time seemed to rest. And for the first time, I didn't need a reason to be there. I simply was.